Welcoming our witnesses and everyone else, all our staff. It's nice to see you all again. And recognizing the critical importance of this matter before us today, I'm pleased to call this hearing to order. I'm particularly pleased to welcome a panel of witnesses uniquely prepared to help us understand better the impacts of PFAS in our lives, our communities, and our states. A warm welcome to Joanne Stanton, to Jim Kenney, to Scott Mandarola, and Tracy Meehan. Some of you are not strangers, and we've been with you before, and we welcome a chance to be with you all again. But thank you for your willingness to share your experience and your perspectives with us today. As you all may know, I'm privileged to represent Delaware, one of the smallest states in our union, although a state that sometimes punches above its weight. And despite the fact that our population numbers just under 1 million people, every one of our 3 Delaware counties has been plagued by the presence of PFAS chemicals in drinking waters. In fact, while I hate to say it, there's not one of the states represented by the senators sitting around this dais or in the entire Senate that is not struggling to address this problem for their citizens and their communities. If this were merely a question of some pesky pollutant that occasionally finds its way into our groundwater and water wells on a very localized level, that would be one thing. That's not the situation that we all face today. And what we're dealing with here is an almost universal persistent toxin. Its presence in our water at levels measured in parts per trillion creates a very real risk of adverse developmental effects to fetuses and breastfed babies. This toxin is also associated with testicular and kidney cancer, liver tissue damage, as well as with harmful changes to the thyroid and the immune system. It's not just a public health concern. The presence of PFAS in our communities and our drinking water is having major impact on livelihoods as well. People in affected communities are worried about falling property values, and farmers with contaminated lands and dairy herds are, sometimes out of business. According to Bloomberg News, Stone Ridge Farms, a 100-year-old family business near Arundel, Maine, was forced to shutter in 2019 due to PFAS contamination from sludge that was spread on the farm as fertilizer. And as we'll hear shortly in the testimony here, the farm in Maine is far from the only farm adversely affected by PFAS-contaminated sludge. We'll also hear that states across America are scrambling to protect citizens and restore contaminated lands and waters in the presence of needed federal action on PFAS. In early May, attorneys general from 18 states and the District of Columbia commented on the challenges posed by EPA inaction in their comments to EPA on its proposed rule to require public water systems to test for PFAS compounds. In those comments, these AGs said, and I'm going to quote them, they said, millions of people across the United States are exposed to PFAS-contaminated drinking water and widespread releases of PFAS into the environment. Many of the states have limited resources to comprehensively assess and address PFAS. Therefore, it is crucial for EPA to broadly regulate PFAS to protect the public health and the environment, close quote. Another outcome of varied state approaches to regulating PFAS is the familiar challenge of a patchwork regulatory requirements, which could hamper an effective and efficient national effort to manage a nationwide public health threat. It will not be long before we all hear from our business communities about the challenge of meeting disparate requirements amongst the states. Bottom line is this: PFAS is a sinister and pervasive threat to our families' health, a drag on local, state, and national economies, and a problem that will not go away on its own. We need strategic national policies, programs, and investments to help us determine where PFAS contamination is, the health threats that these chemicals can pose, the best methods to rid our water and lands of the so-called forever chemicals, and a host of other issues that are related with this class of chemicals. What we lack, and I suspect all our witnesses here today will agree, is a sense of urgency to address these and other questions and to provide the relief that many affected communities and families need, particularly those with vulnerable infants and children. So once again, I want to welcome on behalf of our entire committee each of our witnesses, and thank you for sharing your testimony and your stories with us. And with that, I'm pleased to recognize for her opening statement our ranking member whose state of West Virginia has endured far more than its fair share of PFAS contamination. Senator Capito.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here today, and thanks for calling this hearing. Addressing the challenges of PFAS contamination has been one of my highest environmental policy priorities, as many of you know, and I've long had led bipartisan efforts to address this issue. For example, I took the lead role in provisions reported out of this committee and included in the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, establishing a clear process for EPA to publicly share information from PFAS manufacturers, processors, and users around the country. To address the substantial environmental and public health impacts from PFAS in West Virginia, I secured language in the fiscal year 2019 Department of Defense Appropriations Act to reimburse the city of Martinsburg for the significant costs involved in upgrading the Big Springs water treatment facility. The upgrades at that facility address PFAS resulting from federal government releases from the base of aqueous firefighting foam detected in their drinking water. I also ensured that Berkeley County, which is where Martinsburg is, was included in a joint study between the Department of Defense and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry on PFAS exposure in populations living and working on and around military bases. Of particular importance to me is the timely action by the EPA to set drinking water standards for two specific PFAS, PFOS and PFOA. Assuring the American people's confidence that their drinking water is safe is essential. And I've pressured the EPA directly, both the prior administrator and this one, and via legislative proposals for years to move forward on regulating PFAS and PFOA. That process is now underway, though it was temporarily frozen by the Biden administration when they first came into office, along with a lot of other policies that were frozen. So we wrote to the president, and in response to my February 17, 2021 letter flagging this issue for White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain, EPA promptly reissued its final determination to regulate PFAS and PFOA under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So I'm very grateful to Mr. Klain for his quick response and for the president as well, and that the EPA continues to work expeditiously to establish a national primary drinking water regulation. However, as we know, more work remains. I agree with the EPA's assessment that many of the regulatory and enforcement actions the executive branch and states may pursue relative to PFAS hinge on continued research and a more in-depth understanding of the chemistry, environment, and health challenges posed by this broad class of compounds. I wrote to the EPA on April 19, 2021, requesting updated information on the agency's research initiatives in order to inform me and my colleagues when we can expect the scientific data and information required to support regulatory actions and when they will be available to EPA. Unfortunately, I'm still waiting for a response from the agency. It is critical that EPA ensures that science and not politics is driving EPA's regulatory decisions. While the federal government continues its much-needed regulatory processes, West Virginia has utilized its state authorities to take action, led by the Department of Environmental Protection. Sadly, West Virginia has faced the legacy of PFAS contamination originating from both industrial and military sites, the two major sources of contamination nationally. But it is this experience that has made the state government vigilant in its response. A chemical facility in Parkersburg led to PFAS pollution entering the environment for decades and resulted in an unprecedented epidemiological study of the population to identify the resulting health risks. As I mentioned earlier, in Martinsburg, on the other side of our state, an Air National Guard base use of PFAS-laden firefighting foams contaminated the Big Springs water filtration plant. I worked with my colleague, Senator Manchin, to secure the nearly $5 million needed to provide the necessary filtration system for that system after the military first agreed to pay for it and then they tried to walk away. But we wouldn't let them. I know there are similar stories around the country. As I believe we all know and will be reaffirmed today, PFAS are all over this country with background levels of contamination from a multitude of sources. but the actual threats to human health and the immediate environment tend to be highly localized, which is exactly why a deliberative, science-based approach to testing and remediation is necessary. West Virginia, the state of West Virginia, authorized and funded a review of its drinking water systems, and currently the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection is sampling for PFAS in nearly every community water system across the state. I am very pleased that Scott Mandarola is here as a witness to provide an update on this ongoing effort. While I'm proud to see West Virginia taking initiative in response to PFAS contamination, I'm also aware of the critical need for continued scientific research to form the basis of appropriate federal action that supports West Virginia and other states as they try to assess and respond to these challenges. With plenty of misinformation out there, appropriate risk communication from the federal government is crucial for helping state and local governments and our constituents understand and address PFAS pollution and not undermine the ability for states and localities to do so. I very much look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these topics today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Capito, thanks very much for your statement. Our colleagues on this committee will remember a hearing we held last month on 3 nominees, all women, for senior positions, including at EPA. And one of those was Dr. Michal Friedoff, a member of this committee's staff for a number of years. And she was reported out 19-1. And I've been urging our leadership on our side of the aisle to bring that nomination to a vote, and I would just ask our Republican colleagues to do whatever you can to make sure that she gets a vote, and so maybe we'll get somebody to answer our letters more promptly. So there you go. All right. I again welcome everybody, and I'm going to introduce a couple of witnesses, and then we're going to have I think Senator Capito is going to introduce at least one of them. Our first witness is Joanne Stanton, the co-founder of the Bucksmont Coalition for Safer Water in Warminster, Pennsylvania. Ms. Stanton grew up near 2 military bases, both of which have become Superfund sites. I'd note for the record, during the time that I spent in the Naval Reserve, 18 years plus 5 years active, I flew out of one of those bases, Willow Grove Naval Air Station, as a P-3 aircraft mission commander for 18 years. And I think I could put my car in like autopilot from Wilmington, Delaware to Willow Grove Naval Air Station after 18 years, and it would drive itself. But Ms. Stanton became a community activist in 2015 after learning of our decades-long exposure to PFAS through contaminated water in her community. So we welcome you today to our committee, Ms. Stanton. Also pleased to introduce Jim Kenney, who serves as the Cabinet Secretary for the New Mexico Environment Department. And prior to his current appointment, Secretary Kenney spent more than 20 years across 2 stints at US EPA, most recently as a senior advisor for oil and gas, and also as an environmental engineer leading both criminal and civil investigations related to environmental statutes. Thank you for joining us today, Secretary Kenney. And I think I'm also going to introduce Tracy Meehan. Tracy, who serves as the Executive Director for Governmental Affairs at the American Water Works Association. Mr. Meehan has a long career working on water policy and served as an Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Water from 2001 to 2003. And with that, let me just yield to Senator Capito to introduce our final witness.
Sure, thank you. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Scott Mandarola, who is joining us today from Elkview, West Virginia, to share his expertise on these issues. He is the Deputy Secretary for External Affairs, as well as the Chief Science Officer for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. He's worked for the department since 2006, when he first joined the Division of Water and Waste Management to manage the statewide Water Quality Standards Program before becoming Director of the division in 2010. Prior to joining the department, Scott worked for 17 years for SGS Environmental Services, and before that, at the Connecticut Department of Health Services in the Water Supplies section. He has extensive experience working on water issues, and I'm eager to hear his update on the statewide sampling for PFAS in West Virginia. The excellent work of Scott and his department are a valuable asset to the people of West Virginia, and I think my colleagues will find his testimony extremely useful to our committee as we consider PFAS policies in this Congress.
All right, thanks for that introduction. Let me just say to our colleagues, I don't know what all you did during the recess last week, but I covered my little state. We only have 3 counties, so it's not hard. And but a lot of times go around the state of Delaware, and I would hear from people, why don't you all work together? Why don't you find things you can work on together? And the work that we've done on water infrastructure, clean drinking water, wastewater sanitation, unanimously endorsed by the Senate 89-2 a month ago. And the work that we did in reporting out unanimously surface transportation legislation here just a couple of weeks ago, it's gotten pretty good attention in my state, and I hope in your state as well. And we're known in this, and as I say to our witnesses, we're known in this committee to be a workhorse committee, not a showhorse committee. We get stuff done. And I think we have the opportunity on PFAS, and not before, we have another great opportunity here to get stuff done, important stuff done for people in every one of our states. Every one of our states are affected by this. So with that in mind, let me, let's see, let's just turn to your testimony, Stan. You're our lead off here, and let's begin with you. And you're recognized at this time for your statement. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Senator, and good morning. My name is Joanne Stanton. I grew up in Warminster, Pennsylvania, about 2 miles from 2 separate military bases that both used AFFF, the foam used by firefighters. My PFAS story started when I was a young mother. About 7 years ago, our community was devastated to find out that our drinking water had been highly contaminated with PFAS for nearly 50 years, with some of the highest levels of PFAS pollution ever detected in public drinking water samples. As you can imagine, as a mother, I started to read everything I could possibly get my hands on about PFAS. And when I began to research the health effects, I learned that some of these chemicals can cross the placenta, and they can affect a developing fetus. Animal studies showed that they cause cancer, tumors, neurodevelopmental problems, and even second-generation health effects. The magnitude of what I was uncovering really hit me like a ton of bricks, and I literally fell to my knees and started crying, because my mind raced back to an earlier time when my son was diagnosed with a cancerous brain tumor at age 6. Back then, after my son's surgery, epidemiologists came into my son's hospital room and began pummeling my husband and I with very pointed questions. Where do you live? Where was your early pregnancy? Have you or your husband ever worked with chemicals or pesticides? They told us at that moment that they found embryonic tissue in the very center of his tumor. That meant that it started to form during my pregnancy. Now, there are 3 of us who grew up together in Warminster on the same street within just a few houses that each had children of our own with brain tumors. All the tumors were cancerous. All the tumors had embryonic tissue in the core. Doctors immediately questioned our environmental exposures, and we realized that we all had drank PFAS-contaminated water throughout our entire childhoods and during our pregnancies. As you can imagine, as a mother, it was gut-wrenching for me to be told that my exposure may have actually caused my child's cancer. But what was truly sickening for me was to learn that both the Department of Defense and the chemical manufacturers had known since the 1970s just how poisonous PFAS are, and they chose to be silent. They chose to watch people in surrounding communities get sick and sometimes die without warning us at all. And then I came to find out that the EPA also knew, since about 1998, just how toxic PFAS are, and they too failed to protect us. In my town, where I grew up, we have 3-year-olds with kidney cancer who may never get a chance to do something as simple as learn how to ride a bike or put their first tooth under their pillow. There are new moms who don't feel they can safely breastfeed their babies due to the high level of PFAS found in their breast milk. And today, the Department of Defense is refusing to clean up legacy pollution across the country. It's been 8 years since we learned about PFAS at our 2 military sites, yet the chemicals are still polluting our public waterways. Within the past couple of years, PFAS groundwater on base has measured over 4,000, has been measured at 4,000 times what the EPA's current health advisory is for drinking water. And discharge levels in the runoff coming off base have far exceeded limits set in temporary discharge permits. No one seems to be able to hold them accountable. How can this be? It's the EPA's job to regulate chemicals, to set safe drinking water standards, and to hold polluters accountable, even when that polluter is the Department of Defense. And it's your job to hold the EPA accountable when the agency fails to act. You all have the power to change the current course of history. You have the power to protect people like me, communities like mine. You have the power to designate PFAS as a hazardous substance under CERCLA, as Chairman Carper has proposed in the PFAS Action Act, which will ensure that PFAS pollution in communities like mine is treated as an urgent priority. You have the power to set a 2-year deadline for a federal drinking water standard for PFAS, as Senator Capito has proposed in the Protect Drinking Water from PFAS Act. That's going to ensure that all communities across the country have safe drinking water. Why should my neighbors in New Jersey have safer drinking water than someone like me who lives in Pennsylvania? You also have the power to set a deadline to clean up PFAS at military installations, precisely what Senator Gillibrand's 50 Filthy and Senator Padilla's Clean Water for Military Families Act would jointly do to help communities like mine. Look, my story is not unique. There are thousands of stories like mine across this country. On a personal note, my son was one of the lucky ones. He survived cancer, but it did not come without a price. As a mother, watching my vibrant, bright child slowly fade into a disabled adult has been one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. Today, he's 30 years old. He still lives at home. He can't drive. He probably won't marry and have children or experience many of the joys in life that we had dreamed of for him. I now realize that stronger regulations governing environmental pollutants like PFAS could have prevented needless suffering for me and for so many, many people in my community. It might be too late for my son, but it is not too late for others. Our children, our grandchildren cannot afford to wait another minute. The fact remains that the Department of Defense is one of the largest polluters in this country. And I find it ironic that the very entity whose job it is to protect the American people has given a lot of American people cancer and other diseases. You all have the power to hold both the DOD and the EPA accountable. You have the power to change the way things are and ensure that our children, our grandchildren, and future generations are better protected than we are. As a mother, I implore you to act on PFAS with urgency and action. Thank you.
I know you speak from the heart, and I would say as not just as a senator and a chairman of this committee, but as a father who's helped raise 3 boys. And I speak for all of us to just say we appreciate your deep and sincere sadness, and we want to express our concern and sympathy for what your family's been through. Nobody should have to go through that. Nobody should have to go through it. And my hope is that your testimony here today will enable us to prevent this from happening to others and have them endure what your families had to endure. So
Thank you.
With that, I'm going to call our next witness. I think he's joined us remotely. Is that right? Secretary Kinney's out there. Secretary Kinney, where are you today? Earth calling Secretary Kinney. Come in. Secretary Kinney, can you hear me?
Chairman, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
No, we can't. No, actually, we can. We can hear you. We can hear you clearly now. Welcome aboard. Where are you?
I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Well, good. We're delighted. Good to see you. Hi. Good to see you out there. And
Thank
welcome.
you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks for being here too, as well. You're recognized. Take it away.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee, my name is James Kenny, and I'm the Cabinet Secretary for the New Mexico Environment Department under Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today on behalf of the state of New Mexico. Simply stated, the mission of my department is to protect the health of New Mexicans. The reality is I can't do so when it comes to PFAS. It's not for a lack of scientific data or remedial technology. What we're lacking is a federal regulatory framework for PFAS. The EPA Drinking Water Health Advisory from 2016 was a great start, but it's now 2021, and there's no regulatory certainty for states and our communities. No person should suffer the negative health effects of PFAS, not in New Mexico or elsewhere, which is why states have been taking action to protect their communities. And I've been asked many times by New Mexicans, is my water safe? Are my agricultural products impacted? How is my property value affected? And why isn't EPA and why aren't you doing more? States commonly tackle problems impacting their communities. What's not common is when such efforts are met with federal lawsuits. The United States Air Force sued New Mexico to prevent the cleanup of PFAS at Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico. The Air Force argued Congress did not give EPA and states the authority to clean up PFAS under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, a hazardous waste management law passed by this body. The Department of Justice and the Air Force are trying to reshape the intended purpose of this act. It's clear that Congress intended for this act to protect all Americans, including the dairy farmer just outside of Cannon Air Force Base, who learned in 2018 his cows were contaminated with PFAS. He lost millions in milk sales, and he's now faced with disposing of thousands of PFAS-contaminated cow carcasses. New Mexico also sued the Air Force due to the imminent and substantial endangerment from PFAS contamination at Cannon Air Force Base and Holloman Air Force Base. And for perspective, PFAS levels at Cannon Air Force Base were 370 times the EPA health advisory, and PFAS levels at Holloman Air Force Base were 27,000 times the EPA health advisory. This is clearly a public health, environmental, and economic crisis for New Mexico and other states. And you don't have to live near an Air Force base to be concerned about exposure to PFAS. Every day, news articles appear about the PFAS in consumer products. Recently, we were shopping for a rug in Albuquerque from a national furniture retail store. The retailer offered a fabric protection treatment and told us it was safe for people, pets, and the environment. I asked for information on the fabric protection treatment out of curiosity and noticed it contained PFAS. Aside from the concerns over consumer disclosure and employee safety for those who are applying the chemical, the retailer will continue to generate PFAS waste from the application process, and these wastes will end up in our municipal landfills and our wastewater treatment plants. The point being is PFAS is moving throughout our economy and throughout our environment completely unregulated by the federal government. In conclusion, to reduce and eliminate the risk from PFAS, we need a whole of government approach. This is where Congress can help. By affirming that discarded PFAS is a hazardous waste under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, this will immediately create a national cradle-to-grave approach across 50 states and territories that have EPA-approved hazardous waste programs. This will allow states to definitively address PFAS, including contamination at Air Force bases, PFAS waste generated by retailers, and once enacted, a national drinking water standard, we will be dealing with wastewater treatment sludges, and this will, again, help with that effort. Lastly, Congress must directly fund states. We are the front lines. We are managing the increased cost of PFAS responses, and we're being responsive to our communities. New Mexico, like other states, cannot equally protect its communities without such funding. I appreciate the opportunity to provide my perspective and recommendations, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary Kinney, thank you very much for joining us. And now I'm going to call on Mr. Meehan. Mr. Meehan, you recognize next, please.
Thank you. Is that working now? It's Tracy Meehan. I'm Executive Director for Government Affairs of the American Water Works Association, and like the other panelists, most grateful to be able to address you today on this pressing public health issue. Before I get into PFAS, I would like to thank you on behalf of our 50,000 members for your excellent work and collaboration on S915, Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act of 2021. This is most a welcome development. The overwhelming bipartisan approval shows that your work was very fruitful. We are also pleased to see the parity now between, at least ultimately, between the two SRFs, between the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water SRF. And so for your hard work on that, we are extremely grateful.
We want to thank you and a lot of folks around your counterparts around the country for the great work that you did in helping us to write the legislation. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Turning to the categories of chemical compounds known as PFAS, I'd like to discuss several issues, at least to the extent I can. One is other authorities that EPA could be using to address this problem beyond just the Safe Drinking Water Act, but then also discuss the theme that Senator Capito mentioned, a need for research to do important and successful regulation, especially under the Safe Drinking Water Act. and if there's time, address any number of issues that you can find in our written testimony. Regarding existing authorities, we still believe, and we've testified this previously before this committee, that the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, is a huge tool that is not being utilized by the agency. TSCA has data gathering authority that the agency could use to garner more information from the manufacturing sector about the number of PFAS compounds that have been developed, in what quantities they were produced, and where they were produced. TSCA data indicates that the manufacturers have already, as we know, discontinued use of a number of the PFAS compounds, but state and local risk managers need more information than is currently available to manage not just legacy compounds, but proactively manage PFAS that are currently in use. Deploying TSCA authorities in service of safe drinking water is source water protection, really at the most strategic level. And again, not just that law, but the Clean Water Act can come into play controlling PFAS as well. And information gleaned from TSCA can help the assessment of PFAS in the environment and the development of industrial pre-treatment actions under that Clean Water Act. Clean Water Authority is important in the development of analytical methods for PFAS in industrial wastewaters and in development of appropriate and reliable treatment methods. EPA has yet to take substantial action under TSCA or the Clean Water Act to collect substantial data on PFAS in the United States. In contrast, my members are going to be subjected to a necessary but very onerous process under UCMR 5, placing responsibility on water systems to take the lead to identify potential sources of PFAS in the environment, as opposed to taking actions under TSCA and the Clean Water Act to substantively identify these sources. This will again place the burden onto public water systems and their customers to address PFAS issues that were caused by other polluters. What happened to the polluter pays principle? AWWA continues to emphasize the need for EPA to take action under TSCA and other authorities, such as provide a report in 1 year and update it every 2 years describing the location of current and past PFAS production, import, processing, and use in the U.S. of individual PFAS compounds based on data collected through TSCA, and appropriation of actions or report on actions planned or otherwise to restrict production, use, and import. We have several other recommendations relating to TSCA and the Clean Water Act, and I'll refer to my written testimony. Research, we have many suggestions in our written testimony. It's absolutely fundamental. The reason why we probably haven't had as many regulatory determinations under the 96 amendments is because of lack of occurrence data and necessary toxicology to make informed, science-based, data-driven, risk-focused decisions. And research is absolutely key, and resources in that area are essential. Thank you for your time today. Most grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan. And next, we're going to hear from Mr. Mandrola.
Thank you. Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. Good morning. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today to represent West Virginia in this dialogue about PFAS contamination and its impact on water quality. And thank you, Senator Capito, for your persistence in helping Martinsburg pursue reimbursement from the Department of Defense, and for being a champion on this issue for the state of West Virginia and the nation. As you know, West Virginia was made a focal point of this issue in 2019 with the release of the movie Dark Waters, which is based on a story of an attorney who takes a stand against a large chemical company that has contaminated a small town's drinking water with PFOA. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, were manufactured and used in a variety of industries around the globe since the 1940s. PFOA and PFOS are the most studied of several thousand PFAS compounds. PFAS is estimated to be present in the blood of almost all U.S. residents. The EPA recently developed a health advisory level for the combined concentration of PFOA and PFOS in drinking water of 70 parts per trillion, and is in the process of developing a maximum contamination level for drinking water. While EPA continues to study the toxicity of PFAS chemicals, West Virginia created a PFAS work group in 2019 in order to understand the potential problem. The work group consisted of members from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources, and the United States Geological Service. It determined early on that the most significant exposure pathway in the state is contaminated drinking water. The work group asked USGS to create a study plan to sample and analyze every public water system regulated by the West Virginia DHHR, including schools and daycare facilities. The project analyzes untreated water from both groundwater and surface water intakes for the presence of 26 PFAS compounds. While the work group planned its study, the West Virginia legislature debated action on PFAS in the form of a bill named the Clean Water Act of 2020, which required the state to develop water quality standards and maximum contamination levels. Following DEP's discussion with State Senate about the planned testing activity for PFAS across the state, the Senate created and passed Senate Concurrent Resolution 46, directing the West Virginia DEP and the West Virginia DHHR to propose and initiate a plan to sample PFAS substances in all community water systems in West Virginia. Our drinking water study began in July of 2020. The study will take 2 years, the first for sampling, the second to conduct data analysis and draft a report. When complete, the state's 279 public water systems will have been tested. The USGS completed sampling of all the sites last month. To date, USGS has received preliminary results for 273 sites. The study revealed 5 sites that tested positive for the presence of PFOA and PFOS in excess of EPA's health advisory limit of 70 parts per trillion. The Lubeck, Vienna, and Parkersburg public water systems are contaminated by PFOA related to the production and use of C8 at the Washington Works DuPont facility. In Martinsburg, the public water system is contaminated primarily by PFOS associated with the historical use of AFFF firefighting foam at a local military installation. The Glendale public water system is contaminated by PFOS, likely related to the historic use of the compounds in metal plating industries, although further investigation is still underway. These preliminary results revealed only 2 areas of known contamination in West Virginia, along the industrialized Ohio River corridor and the eastern panhandle of the state. Fortunately, the rest of West Virginia shows little PFAS contamination. In summary, thanks to USGS's work with the state, West Virginia has developed an extensive database of PFAS results. The next step in the protection of public health is the development of a safe exposure limit for PFAS compounds. Although some states have developed their own MCLs and water quality standards, West Virginia and many other states are relying on EPA Office of Research and Development to develop national guidelines and regulations for the protection of human health from these chemicals. In closing, I would like to thank the committee for its effort to protect the public from PFAS. Thank you.
Ms. Manrola, thanks. Thanks so much for joining us from West Virginia, Mountain State. I want to ask maybe the same question of you, Ms. Stanton, and maybe the same question of Secretary Kinney, maybe a 2-part question, but it deals with discovering the problem. Ms. Stanton, would you just describe for us who first discovered that PFAS was a problem in the community where you and your family live? Or in the case, Secretary Kinney, in your state of New Mexico, question is, who first discovered? If you can help us with that, Ms. Stanton.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator. For us, it was the summer of 2014, and local water companies did sampling under EPA's UCMR 3. And that's what got the hit and started everything in motion.
All right. Secretary Kinney, can you help us with that same question? Anybody, how folks in your state first became aware of this problem?
Yes, there was, I almost want to ask you which problem. There are multiple PFAS problems in the state of New Mexico, like there are in many states. With respect to our Air Force bases, the two that I mentioned earlier, they disclosed the problem to us in 2018 after looking into it prior to my tenure. And we are also, like West Virginia and other states, working through the USGS to look across counties in New Mexico to see where there are PFAS problems. So we're actively engaged in looking for them and finding them.
Could either of you just mention for us what might have motivated the folks who discovered this contamination? What motivated them to do it? Any idea? Ms. Stanton, you want to take a shot at that? Any idea what motivated the folks who made this detection of contamination? What motivated them?
The EPA?
Okay, all right.
I mean,
Okay. Mr. Kenny, Secretary Kenny? Same question.
Senator, what motivated us here is a concern for public health, knowing that where we look for these omnipresent, ubiquitous, hard to treat chemicals, we will find them. So it was our due diligence to go out and look. What motivated the Air Force to look for the chemicals? I believe there is impetus by federal agencies and maybe this congressional body.
All right, thank you. Secretary Kenny, another question for you, if I may. Please describe for us some of the specific public health and economic challenges faced by your state as a result of the PFAS contamination. And would you specifically discuss the impact of PFAS contamination on your agricultural producers?
Thank you for that question, Senator. The environmental impacts and economic impacts are real for our state. And you'll see in my written testimony that we have seen implications from environmental impacts historically in New Mexico. Things like Gold King Mine really affected our economy from an outdoor recreation, from a tourism perspective. And we fear that that could be the same outcome that could result from things like PFAS contamination. Holloman Air Force Base is directly adjacent to the most popular state park or national park in New Mexico, White Sands, with 600,000 visitors a year. So we are concerned about the economic impact to those industries, and most important to our agricultural industry, a $3 billion a year industry that is threatened by PFAS contamination. I would be remiss to say to this committee as well as to those listening that we are actively engaged with testing agricultural products to ensure their safety. That is something we've been embarking on now for a while. But we are concerned about the public health, environmental, and economic impacts.
You've spoken to this already. Let me just ask one last follow-up. And would you just share with us some of the primary challenges that the state of New Mexico is facing in dealing with this contamination, please?
Again, thank you for the question. The challenges that we're facing is a lack of the regulatory framework in order to protect New Mexicans. Specifically, let me give you this example. When we find PFAS and it's above the EPA health advisory level, and we know that other states have set much lower standards, it is complicated to assure the public and even ourselves as regulators as what the right outcome should be. How do you treat down to that level? What do you remediate to? So the lack of standards presents not only a question of where do you start, but where do you end?
Thank you, sir. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mandarola, I'd like to ask a couple questions. You mentioned the 5 communities that had a higher level, and that the rest of West Virginia had little or no trace PFAS contamination. You mentioned there were 273 community water systems that were tested. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's actually 279, I believe, that were tested. We haven't got results for all of them back.
You haven't. Okay, so let's go back to the history of this, because I think it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, our state was notified, I believe, by the EPA that in the Parkersburg and Martinsburg area, our water systems were above the levels. Is that how the whole thing sort of started for us, correct?
That's correct. Through the UCMR testing
Okay.
of water systems, Martinsburg was tested for PFAS compounds, and it was determined to have above the action level.
So above the 70 parts per billion?
Correct.
And then they shut the water systems down, right?
That's correct. They took the Big Spring
Offline?
well offline.
Yeah. And then Martinsburg and I believe Vienna was the water system, I think, for the Parkersburg area, then purchased the ability, filters and whatever that would filter this out, right?
That's correct.
That's right. But they're still doing a community assessment, health assessment in the Martinsburg area to see what the effects might be.
That's correct.
Okay. So if you look at where we started and where we've been, I think that raised huge alarm bells for our state, not only because of the impacts, but one of the impacts in Martinsburg, as you know, was the fact that we had an enormous industrial partner that came, P&G, came to build the state-of-the-art manufacturing facility in and around the Martinsburg area in Berkeley County. And one of the provisos was that clean water would be available for their product. Obviously, that's extremely important in a lot of the manufacturing. And this became the real strain, I think, for Martinsburg to be able to get back online, to be able to fulfill their commitment to Procter & Gamble. Yeah. So
That is correct.
Right. So as we move forward on this, I'm sure there's a lot of trepidation on the community water systems as to what is this going to mean when you know that Martinsburg was $4 million. I can't remember what Parkersburg was. In working with the local community water systems, how are they looking at this as a potential effect in the communities? I mean, I grew up in Glendale. I grew up drinking this water. And so, what are you seeing in the community in terms of what effect? And are they frustrated because they can't really get a drinking water standard that they can really meet the technology to?
To this point, yes. I mean, there's obviously concern over an advisory level versus a MCL.
Right.
Issued by EPA. Currently, obviously, you were instrumental in DOD reimbursing Martinsburg for their water system. The facilities around the Parkersburg Chemours facility, those have all had treatment installed, and it's being done under an enforcement action between EPA and the state and Chemours that it's been in place prior to my coming to the DEP in 2006. They're required to test all public and private sources of drinking water around their facility, and if it's above the advisory limit, they're then required to either replace the drinking water source or supply an alternate source or treat it.
Now, you mentioned when I was talking with you when we first started that Orsanco, which is I won't even try to get it, the Ohio River.
Ohio River Sanitation Commission.
Thank you very much. Is conducting a study of their own. What does that consist of?
They're doing a study that's going to consist of the entire length of the Ohio River. They're doing 20 samples spaced roughly 50 miles apart. They're randomly chosen the first sample and then spacing them down the river. And what it is more of a background level sampling. They're not really doing source tracing at this point, but they're trying to determine, similar to what we were doing in West Virginia, do we have a problem? And if we do, what's the extent of it? Mm-hmm. So they will be doing, utilizing USGS sampling methods to do both depth integrated and width integrated sampling across the river to try to determine,
right,
is there PFAS and where in the water column is it if there is?
Right, and it's important to note that several of the communities of the 5 communities that came up above the level are located along the Ohio River. So
that's correct.
I applaud that for moving forward on that, and I'm ready to keep working with you to make sure we get this right. Thank you.
And that study starts in 2 weeks.
Great, thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. I think at the order of questions now, I think Senator Cardin's going to join us by WebEx, and he'll be succeeded by Senator Inhofe, who's here in person. So, Ben, you're recognized if you able to
Thank
join
you.
us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all of our witnesses for their testimony and for their work for clean water. We want our policies in regards to the detection and remedial work to be based upon best science. And I think that's been made very clear. I applaud the leadership of our committee in pushing the issues on PFAS. We have studied the situation in Maryland. We don't have a complete analysis, but we know that in at least one water system plant, we've detected an unacceptable level. We have 4 military installations where we have detected concerns. And I just want to follow up on Senator Capito's question, if I might, and that is obviously our first order is to make sure we have the safety of our community. So work needs to be done, whether it's in a remedial work in an installation or whether it's in our water treatment facility plant upgrades. But my concern is this: we already have severe pressure on the ratepayers in dealing with the cost of safe water. We need to have some degree of holding those responsible accountable for that. It's one thing for Congress to make a specific appropriation to deal with a particular circumstance, but this is now widespread. What advice do you have that we can hold those who are responsible accountable for the remedial work so that we can keep the pressure off the ratepayers in having to foot the bill for the costs of the remedial work? Any suggestions from those that are responsible for your water systems in your particular states?
Is that address-
Go ahead.
Kenny, you want to go
Yes,
first?
Senator. We've been lucky in West Virginia in that we were able to get reimbursed by DOD, and we have, through an enforcement action with EPA, been able to hold the facility that contaminated the majority of the other facilities or water treatment plants accountable. It's a very big concern for us as well, for our ratepayers. We can't. It's going to be impractical to expect ratepayers to pick up the cost of, for instance, Martinsburg, I think, was $4.9 million.
Would you say impractical or unfair?
I'm sorry, it's not really going to be practical for us to hold them accountable. And that's why we took the approach we did with Chemours. I'm not sure how we hold them accountable. As I said, EPA was very helpful in their enforcement action in that effect.
You know, and my concern is that it may have worked well for West Virginia, but Mr. Chairman, we need some national direction to hold those responsible accountable, whether it's private industry or whether it's the Department of Defense. Is the story of West Virginia common in other states that we found the ability to enforce the costs against those who are responsible?
Senator, Mr. Meehan has his hand up. Go ahead, and then come back to.
I just would want to point out, Senator, we're seeing a situation relative to PFAS that looks very much like the old problems under MTBE, where now we're seeing water utilities as plaintiffs in common law cost recovery actions using common law theories like public nuisance, et cetera, trespass. And Orange County, California, I know, has 6 law firms on contract just beginning to pursue claims based not on a regulatory standard, but on a health advisory from the state of California. I just read where Dayton has filed suit against the Air Force. New York utilities, there's litigation in North Carolina. So the utility sector, at least those that are incurring major expenses, is taking action, and I think there will be a sort of a land office business on plaintiffs' work in the water utility sector.
Yeah. Others, please. Yes. Ms. Stanton.
Yes, thank you, Senator. At least in Pennsylvania, where I am, we have not been able to hold the DOD accountable, and ratepayers have been paying almost double water bills for the last 7 years. And just within the last 12 months, we have gotten some relief. There are several townships involved. We had got some state funding, but that is what it's coming through. We're not going to be fully refunded. I don't think it's going to be retroactive. So it's a long time to pay up to double water bills, 7 years, and not be able to hold the polluter accountable.
Yes, ma'am.
I see Mr. Kenny might want to make a response.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Senator Cardin, appreciate that question. The ability for states to hold polluters accountable is contingent upon a secure regulatory framework, and that's one of the areas where I think Congress can be helpful under listing PFAS as a RCRA hazardous waste. The other piece of this is there will be times in which we don't have a responsible party. So where we do have one, absolutely they should be held accountable through strict enforcement, as well as those who are not accountable. We need to have funding so that we can move the cleanup forward and then find the responsible party if possible.
All right.
Thank you. This is an area, Mr. Chairman, I hope that we will follow up.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Senator Cardin, for joining us. Senator Inhofe, you're next, and then you'll be succeeded by, I think, Senator Stabenow by WebEx, and then Senator Padilla.
Okay.
Senator Inhofe.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this. And of course, I used to chair this committee, and we've been addressing this for a long period of time. And we haven't found the solutions yet. I think we're kind of tending to talk around it. I can remember back when the FAA didn't just require commercial airlines or airports to have available PFAS, but also required them to use it. Now, that's no longer the case, and that was changed in 2018 with the FAA reauthorization. But it's still, even though it's not required, they're still using it. And I think we all agree that that's what's happening right now. So we know the FAA, we know the DOD, everyone's researching it, trying to get a solution. They don't have a solution yet. And we are, and that's the problem that is, and I can't help but think they're arriving at solutions by now, because this has been going on for a long period of time. So I guess, Mr. Mandarola, I would just ask you, are you aware of any PFAS-free foams that are proven to be as effective and fast-acting as PFAS-based foams? I'm reading that question to make sure I get it right, because I expect an answer from you.
Obviously, my specialty is water quality and environmental protection. I'm not a firefighting expert, but I have participated, listened in on a number of PFAS-related presentations, and I'm personally not aware of any replacement that's as effective as AFFF at this time.
You know, and I'm not either, and I have looked, and of course, we've had a lot of these hearings, and we have a lot of experts, and that's kind of the reality of today. Mr. Meehan, as you know, there are hundreds of PFAS in existence, and they're all diverse compounds. Some are liquid, some are gases, and just an unlimited number that are out there. So a lot of people are supporting the lumping all PFAS into a single regulated class, but those proposals are, some feel are misguided because they don't take into account the diverse nature of these chemicals. So I think you are in a position to respond to the question that would you discuss why efforts to regulate all PFAS as one single class would not be the preferred way of doing it.
Well, thank you, Senator. I think,
or it would be difficult, if not impossible, to do.
yeah. Well, you could do it, but it wouldn't be prudent. And you couldn't do it so much with an MCL. You'd have to use a treatments technique, which would then pretty much push everybody to pretty costly treatment technologies. But I think the discussion that was just had about the cost of ratepayers indicates one of the problems with going after the whole class. If you look at our written testimony at the bottom of page 9, we just costed out doing the two legacy PFOA and PFOS, and I think, you know, we're talking $3 billion if you start at the EPA level. If you start using the standards that some of the states are using at the more stricter level, you get to $38 billion, and that's just capital cost for two. If you start adding in O&M and disposal and waste management, it gets up to those costs are $1 billion annually. If you're doing 3, 4, 5, 600, just plug in the numbers in the equation, and the numbers become quite staggering, whether it's using granular activated carbon or to go beyond just, say, 3 or 4 PFAS compounds, then you're into ion exchange and some very expensive treatment. So cost is irrelevant. You know, there's trade-offs to be faced, and I think the wise course of action, AWWA believes the wise course of action is to follow the procedures in the Safe Drinking Water Act and the 96 amendments, which, as I said before, are science-based, data-driven, and risk-focused. That's the prudent way to do it, and it attends to the relative risk issues. We know we've got a new lead and copper rule coming, which is, I saw where Cincinnati is going to increase water rates 3-point-something% this year and then 5.5% for the next 4 years just to deal with lead and copper service line removal. So prudence may sound like a very tame, conservative word, but I think it is the right word to use when you talk about addressing PFAS as an environmental and public health issue.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Inhofe's in a unique position here because he is not only the former chairman of this committee, but the former chairman of the Defense Committee, Armed Services Committee. So he, and you know,
we have a real interest in this, and I know that even our defense authorization legislation, we get into this, and we're concerned about it.
Yeah. All righty. I understand that Senator Stabenow is out there somewhere to join us by WebEx. Senator Stabenow, are you able to hear me? Good morning.
Good morning,
So
Mr.
great state of
Chairman.
Michigan, great state of Michigan, the home of those surging Detroit Tigers. You are recognized, Senator
Thank you.
Stabenow.
Go Tigers. Go Tigers. I so appreciate this hearing. So many of us have been working on various aspects of this, a deeply challenging and concerning set of issues. I just wanted to ask if you would put in the record a copy of an article that just came out yesterday from researchers in the Great Lakes. It's called "It's Literally Raining PFAS Around the Great Lakes."
All right, without objection.
It's literally in the precipitation that's raining down on our crops and our water and our people right now. So deeply concerning. I'd like first to start with Secretary Kenny and say first, I appreciate all the witnesses today. I definitely support establishing a strong national drinking water and cleanup standard for PFAS. And I'm concerned about what happens, though, before federal standards are in place. Like New Mexico, Michigan has significant challenges when it comes to working with the Department of Defense. We're talking about that all this morning to address PFAS contamination on military bases. We have actually detected PFAS on at least 10 bases in Michigan. At one base, we have had readings as high as 32,200 parts per trillion. And at some of the bases, such as Wordsmith in Oscoda and Camp Grayling in Grayling, Michigan, we have PFAS mitigating it off the base and into water sources. And we have lakes and streams where they're sometimes covered by thick foam as a result of PFAS from the bases. We've had test results showing contamination at these times pouring out of Selfridge Air National Guard Base into the Clinton River and Lake St. Clair, which is the source of drinking water for thousands and thousands of Michiganders. So the state of Michigan has established its own drinking water and groundwater standards for numerous PFAS. And under current federal law, it's pretty clear that in the absence of a national standard, the Department of Defense is to comply with state standards. But unfortunately, this is not happening. It's certainly not happening quickly enough. In fact, Congress passed my PFAS Accountability Act, which seeks to pressure the Department of Defense to finalize new cooperative agreements with states and expedite cleanup. The state of Michigan, the governor's recently pursuing that. But there's so many ways. So through the Farm Bill, we've tried to address it. My colleagues on the committee have tried and are trying in so many different ways to expedite this. From your perspective, could you talk more about the other ways you think that Congress should be acting to expedite the cleanup by the Department of Defense? For example, should we push for better interim cleanup standards, looking for ways to compel cleanup action? Appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you, Senator, and your state has been really helpful to us on a number of issues related to PFAS, relating to foams and other things. So I appreciate the technical and advice of Michigan Department of Environment. To answer your question, yes, we absolutely need to compel cleanups. As you probably know, and members of the committee and in other states, the timeframe by which the Department of Defense puts cleanup in the queue for us does not serve our citizens. At Cannon Air Force Base, where the plume is migrating towards our agricultural sector, our industry, the cleanup there was scheduled to start in 2028 under CERCLA authority. That's too late. We have people questioning today if they should get a shower, drink their water their cows. It's too late for that. So we need to act, and we need to hold them accountable and continue with our lawsuit. That's why I think Congress could absolutely affirm that PFAS is a listed hazardous waste under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. I also think this committee could start with giving strict oversight to DOD's implementation under CERCLA and Executive Order 12580 that talks about the Department of Defense and EPA's relationship to cleanup. So those are some immediate thoughts, but the declaring PFAS a listed hazardous waste would create that national framework that I think has been lacking and give us causal action to hold DOD accountable today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit other questions for the record. This is such an important issue.
Well, it is, and you've been a great leader on it, and we appreciate that and look forward to continuing to work with you, Senator Stappenow. Senator Padilla has joined us again. Senator Padilla, welcome, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. I want to ask a couple questions to Ms. Stanton. I deeply, first of all, deeply thank you for highlighting in your testimony the failures by the Department of Defense and the EPA to protect Americans from toxic PFAS chemicals. And believe me, I was moved by your testimony as a father of 3 young boys. So I thank you for turning the injustices that you've experienced and that clearly you felt into action by pushing Congress and federal agencies to hold polluters accountable. And as you said in your testimony, even when it is the Department of Defense. For decades, the Department of Defense knew that they were polluting toxic, poisonous PFAS chemicals into the environment. And even after leading manufacturers voluntarily phased out production of PFOS and PFOA, the DoD still used firefighting foam containing PFAS, which has resulted in the widespread contamination around military sites, not just on the military sites, but in the surrounding communities. Good news is Congress has passed legislation requiring the Department of Defense to phase out the use of AFFF firefighting foams at military installations. And while this is a vital step to ensuring that the Department of Defense adopts PFAS-free alternatives, it does not address the Department of Defense's legacy pollution, nor does it protect communities who continue to suffer from that legacy contamination. In California alone, there are 62 military facilities with a known or suspected release of PFAS chemicals, but the reality is every military base or commercial airport in the country is contaminated to some extent. And yet there's been little to no progress in going back to clean it up. So, Ms. Stanton, again, just want to recognize your courage and your activism. The onus should not be on you to get the Department of Defense to clean up these harmful chemicals. So I'm proud to share that yesterday I introduced a new bill called the Clean Water for Military Families Act, which you acknowledged. This legislation would require the Department of Defense to conduct investigations and remediate the contamination in and around military installations. and it would authorize $10 billion for the Department of Defense to do so. Absent the legislation, at the current rate, it would take decades for the Department of Defense to clean up toxic PFAS, which is simply unacceptable. So I invite you, Ms. Stanton, to share a little bit more, not just to what needs to be done, but the urgency with which we need to act to get the Department of Defense to clean up its legacy pollution in and around military installations, and maybe even discuss for a few minutes how a CERCLA designation could help protect military families and their neighbors.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Padilla. Basically, I mean, we've been hearing about, processes and things like that, and you have to remember from the standpoint of a community member that's been affected, we need to act quickly. We need a sense of urgency. We need deadlines for cleanup. Right now, there's no deadlines. Deny, minimize, and delay has really been the motto that we have gotten from the Department of Defense. So the legislation that you are introducing is going to help so many people, military families, host communities, to be able to provide deadlines for cleanup, because right now that's not happening. And the legacy pollution is unbelievable. We have 2 large PFAS plumes at one at each of our sites. Now, one of our sites was redeveloped over 20 years ago. So we have a large PFAS plume lurking underneath of a park, a playground, a Gilda Radner cancer home, a baseball field. We have monitoring wells that have been so high of late that they had to be turned into pump and treat wells. And that's at the base that they had closed, through CERCLA, and it got opened up because of PFAS. So we definitely need deadlines. Everybody just needs to remember, this is a public health emergency, and everyone's talking about processes, and they're all important. But there are lives at stake here. There are people that are suffering and dying. There's a community that's just about a mile north of the one base in Horsham that has really been hit hard lately. It's a small community of only about 30 homes. And just in that home alone, there was 2 mothers that passed away within the past few weeks. Trying to find my notes here on that community. There's 2 young mothers. The 2 young mothers just passed away. There's 3 teenagers sick, 2 with cancer, 1 with thyroid disease. We have a 12-year-old that has ovarian cancer. Her mother also has cancer, okay? Their next-door neighbor has kidney cancer. That's just one neighborhood. So we really need protection. These PFAS plumes, even when we go to our RAB meetings and we hear the different levels, 1 month the levels are lower in one area and higher in another, and the next month it's just reversed. It's not getting cleaned up. I really don't think that the Department of Defense is handling it well. They don't know what to do, and nothing is happening because there are no deadlines. So your legislation and the financing for that legislation is huge and is going to make just such an important impact on our community, because until this legacy pollution gets cleaned up, we are all at risk. You're all at risk. I mean, PFAS is everywhere, and it's not just the drinking water. It's not just the drinking water. It's our wildlife. It's our produce. Okay, we have had, the sludge is being given away to Pennsylvania farmers as it is across the country as free fertilizer. And then we have our broccoli is turning up with high levels of PFAS. Our wildlife, our deer, our fish. It's just a never-ending. It's a never-ending cycle. And the basis of it is that the Department of Defense is one of the biggest polluters of this, and we have to start to address this legacy pollution. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Padilla, thanks so much for joining us and for your question. We've been joined by Senator Markey. Eddie, you're recognized, please. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because PFAS are used in firefighting foams, they pose a particular danger to our firefighters, our military members, their families, and surrounding communities. Massachusetts has seen higher levels of these forever chemicals near Fort Devens, Barnes Air National Guard Base, Joint Base Cape Cod, and the Barnstable County Firefighter Training Academy. Ms. Stanton, how would designating harmful PFAS as hazardous substances under federal statute help communities near current or former military bases like Westfield and Barnstable, which are struggling with contamination?
Well, declaring it a hazardous substance under CERCLA is going to just begin the whole cleanup process, and that is the most important thing. That is what we need. No matter where we look in the state of Pennsylvania, there's a neighbor who lives just about a mile from the Horsham base whose their worried about their home value for their home because the PFAS pollution is so great. And right now, there's absolutely nothing they can do. It's not against the law in the state of Pennsylvania, okay, to dump PFAS anywhere. Nothing is against the law. It's not declared a hazardous substance. Right now, we're actually taking our PFAS contaminated soil and we just move it to a municipal landfill. All we're doing is moving it around because it is not considered a hazardous substance. So it can be moved, and we're just shifting our pollution from one place to another.
Okay, thank you. Towns across Massachusetts are working hard and finding innovative solutions to pay for PFAS remediation and protect their residents. Natick is planning to spend $3 million on a high-tech carbon filtration system. Littleton has invested $20 million in a PFAS remediation plant, and Wayland is spending $20,000 every single week on bottled water to replace its contaminated wells. Secretary Kenny, would designating PFAS as hazardous waste and conducting a comprehensive federal response to help communities that are struggling to pay to address PFAS contamination from military bases be a good idea?
Senator, yes, that would be a great idea. One, it would deter the sort of incidental use of PFAS, so it would deter certain businesses like maybe furniture retailers from offering that and perpetuating the cycle of PFAS movement in our economy and our environment. Two, I think it would prevent, as Ms. Stanton indicated, the casual movement of materials between municipal waste facilities and farmers and things like that. And three, a big benefit here, and one that I don't take lightly, is that there's economic development opportunities around the technology that would treat PFAS. And we in New Mexico are constantly talking to vendors, our national labs, and other technology companies who are trying to bring down the cost to treat this chemical because they see the importance of it, not only from a public health perspective, but also because water is a precious resource in our state.
So would it be important for states to be able to require the Department of Defense to clean up?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator. We absolutely need that hook in order to move the needle and require cleanup by date certain with consequences for not reaching it.
Yeah, that's obviously looking back retrospectively, the Department of Defense thought that this was all kind of just a sacrifice zone in the areas around these defense facilities, that these communities would have to pay in perpetuity, for having a military base which was sited there. So obviously that was just fundamentally wrong. Can better testing and holding polluters responsible for PFAS contamination help our water systems and ratepayers avoid these costs? Mr. Meehan? Yeah, can better testing and holding polluters responsible for PFAS contamination help our water systems and ratepayers avoid these costs?
Yeah, go, Mike.
Absolutely. I think I would have probably grouped that under the whole area of research, which we put in our written comments, and more data, more information, more risk characterization, toxicology. It's all necessary, and this is a big challenge if we're going to, sort of separate the sheep from the goats in the PFAS family.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously, many firefighters have been exposed to PFAS in their turnout gear. According to recent testing, PFAS has been found in pesticides that have been sprayed across Massachusetts after leaching from the pesticide containers in a chemistry reaction. And even bottled water might not be safe. Water sold in Massachusetts was found to have unsafe levels of PFAS, and there's no federal standard for PFAS contamination in food and drink, which is, at this late date, still unbelievable that we don't set that standard. So thank you all so much for your great work in this area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Senator Markey, just before you arrived, we had a short discussion. We need some folks in place, confirmed in position at EPA who've been nominated, including one we know well, Dr. Michal Friedhoff, who was reported out as committee 19-0 last month for a position where she could actually do some good work with respect to PFAS, TSCA, Toxic Substance Control Act, and we need to get her through the Senate.
I agree with you. You know, as Shakespeare said, the will is infinite, but the execution is confined. And I think I think Shakespeare was referring to the United States Senate. Okay, so we have the will to get that done, to make sure she is confirmed, but executing that goal on the floor of the Senate is somewhat confined. So I think we have to partner, because she will be great, by the way. She'll be a fantastic advocate. Both the
Thank you.
chairman and I know her well, and
We joke to say we both have had the pleasure of working for her. She would agree. All right, thanks, Eddie. All right, we've been joined by the member of our committee with the biggest smile. He's still celebrating the birth of the first grandchild from a week or two ago, and we're happy to recognize our colleague from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Kelly.
and thanks for recognizing my new granddaughter, born about 12 days ago. Very exciting. So thank you, and very important hearing, especially for the state of Arizona. It's a pressing issue and a growing problem, especially near our military installations. In Arizona, the 4 largest groundwater PFAS plumes in our state are centered at current or former military installations in the Phoenix or Tucson metropolitan areas. And as testing has improved and the EPA has provided more guidance, the scope of the contamination has become more significant. Earlier this year, the Air Force took the drastic step of telling more than 1,600 homeowners near Luke Air Force Base to avoid drinking tap water, and they began distributing bottled water. And just yesterday, the water utility in my hometown of Tucson announced that it would indefinitely be shutting down one of its water treatment plants due to an inability to filter out the extensive PFAS contamination. And this isn't just any water treatment plant. It's part of a federal Superfund site and has been cleaning contaminated drinking water since the early 1990s, yet the PFAS contamination proved too significant. It was just too much, and the plant could no longer clean it up. This plant is closed as of yesterday. I mean, this one plant produces around 8% of Tucson's annual drinking water, forcing the city to find other drinking water sources at a time when water users throughout Arizona are preparing for a Tier 1 shortage to be declared in the lower Colorado River Basin. After nearly 20 years of drought, Arizona cannot afford to have additional sources of drinking water contaminated. That's why, as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I'm pushing to ensure language is included in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Bill requiring that the Department of Defense's Environmental Restoration Program gives priority to PFAS cleanup efforts in communities near military installations that rely on groundwater for their drinking water, with a particular emphasis on sole source aquifers like the groundwater aquifer in Tucson. And more must be done to ensure that states in drought-prone regions can use state revolving fund dollars to clean up and proactively prevent PFAS contamination. And I look forward to working on these issues with my colleagues on the committee. So thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Capito, for holding this hearing today. And thank you to our witnesses for being here for this important and, with regards to the state of Arizona, very timely conversation. So my first question here is for Secretary Kenny. I wanted to ask you about proactive PFAS prevention, given the prevalence of PFAS in several Arizona aquifers. Some water systems have sought to make system upgrades before high levels of PFAS are detected to ensure the safety of their drinking water. Yet, while Congress has created programs for PFAS cleanup in recent years, water systems who want to make proactive upgrades must do so using ratepayer revenue. And so many water systems, these costs are unaffordable without federal assistance. So what are the, Secretary Kenny, what are the harms of only providing significant federal resources to help clean up systems with confirmed PFAS contaminations as opposed to funding proactive treatment?
Senator, thank you for that question. Congratulations as well. I think the harm is precisely we're chasing our tail. If we're not preventing PFAS contamination from getting into our drinking water systems, then all we're doing is remediating or chasing it at the treating it at the point of treatment, or trying to remove it at the point of treatment. Then we're not preventing it. Like Arizona, New Mexico has a similar problem with municipal drinking water facilities not being able to absorb the debt in which the Drinking Water and Clean Water Act state revolving funds require. So we have the same problem. And again, focusing on prevention by moving through the CERCLA process, the RCRA process, as I've described, would do a lot to deter PFAS from getting into the system to start with.
Mr. Chairman, is it possible to have one more minute?
It is more than possible.
Thank you. So Secretary Kenny, if Congress appropriates additional funding for PFAS cleanup, how important is it that utilities that have made proactive upgrades to treat PFAS be eligible to be reimbursed for the prior investments that were made?
Senator, I think it's a matter of protecting public health and ensuring that it's not at the cost of the ratepayers. So I think it is absolutely essential that we lean in heavily and make sure that those investments are valued for what they are, and that's preventing people from drinking toxic drinking water.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back my remaining 5 seconds.
We'll use every one of those wisely. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining us. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I had to step out. As all of us know, there's like 4 meetings going on at the same time. So I wanted to slip over to a couple of the appropriations, ask some key questions. I saw Administrator Regan over there, so I told him we get to see him a lot in this committee. I want to say, Ms. Stanton, thank you for coming. And I think putting a human face on what the actual effects can be of something that's not addressed properly, that goes on for years. And I just appreciate your willingness to bring forward a very difficult topic for you, I'm sure, and I'm sure that your dedication is to make sure that this doesn't happen to anybody else. And so I just want to thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity so much. It's really important.
Thank you. Mr. Meehan, let's talk about a little bit, and I hope this isn't too repetitive where we've been. When I was talking with Mr. Mandarolo, I was talking about the different systems, the 137 systems or something like that we have in West Virginia, a lot of small systems. Obviously, you know a lot about the systems. The cost of fixing this can be very expensive. How do you envision our small water systems? What's going to be the best way for them to face this challenge? Is it repeated testing? Is it a national program for repeated testing? Is it a DOD response that needs to be amped up more vibrantly? How do you see us being able to help? I mean, we got a lot of small water systems in our state, so we understand the challenge.
Well, the challenge of small water systems is PFAS is just part of a whole range of challenges. Aging workforce, just maintaining cost. I mean, I was just at a meeting with the California Water Board that said 90% of their violations of the drinking water law is from communities of 500 customers or less. So there's stress there to begin with. PFAS, of course, I was in communication with our colleagues at the National Rural Water Association, and they can tell you that a lot of small communities say, let's take Region 1 New England. I think EPA is requiring for their wastewater systems quarterly, 3 samples a quarter. It gets you up to a couple of thousand. And, again, if you're a couple of hundred customers or connections, these costs are going to be difficult for a small system, not for a Chicago or a Cincinnati, or DC Water. So there is no easy answer. I mean, it's going to require more resources. It's going to require resources from the ratepayers, from the government, federal and state, and I think when it gets around to, let's say, when EPA promulgates an MCL, as it will on at least PFAS and maybe a few more contaminants, they're going to build in a system of regular monitoring depending on the endpoints the MCL sets. And hopefully, we'll see, as we've seen in other rules, a monitoring waiver kicks in after a period of time, a year or two, and then you get several years free from it. So that's all at the margin, though. If you end up getting to treatment, that's where you're, and then the O&M cost and the disposal cost, that's where you really get into the big money.
I will say in our water and wastewater bill that we passed unanimously out of committee, in 89-2 on the floor, we did have a workforce component of that. That was part of we hear this all over our small water systems that while we're both a little sensitive to talking about an aging workforce, we know it's happened everywhere, but particularly it's difficult in this situation. I don't think younger generations see this as a career path, managing water systems and being a part of that scientific community as it's, maybe they have a different view of it. But so we're working on that. Let me ask you, Mr. Mandarola, I know what we're doing in West Virginia, and I really applaud you and your efforts and at the DEP and the legislature for stepping up to this. Are you in contact? I mean, how many other states, I'm sure you're part of a national organization, how many other states are being as aggressive as West Virginia in this? And, couldn't we serve as a shining star here to be able to show the rest of the country how you can proceed and get good results without, completely upsetting the apple cart here?
No, I agree. I always think West Virginia is a shining star when it comes to trying to be proactive on a number of issues. I know, for instance, Michigan and a number of other states. Michigan comes to mind right now. Kentucky was one of them, but have done extensive studies as well. My recommendation would be, there was a lot of fear when we first started this study, because the fear obviously was that we're going to find this everywhere, because in all of the national groups and organizations that I belong to, when there's presentations associated with this, you're dealing with a lot of facilities, as we've heard today, around DOD sites. A lot of states have these DOD sites, and they're finding it everywhere. We have the added bonus of having, a C8 manufacturer in our state. So we were very fearful that we were going to find it everywhere, but the fear of not knowing it was far overcame the fear of what we might find out. I mean, it was extremely important for us to find out what we've got to deal with. And then when EPA comes out with a regulatory scheme for us to follow, we will have the information in the database to take action and take action quickly, rather than having to go out then and spend 2 years doing a study. So that was our thinking behind it. I think it was a good approach. We addressed every water system that DHHR regulates, which goes down to 25 people. So it's fairly extensive.
Yeah, good. That's good. I think that's good advice, to be on the front end, to have the data ready so that we can meet the challenge. And Mr. Meehan, maybe that's something that you can help through your organization. Use this as an example of how you can go about it and be prepared for what we know is coming, and have the data so we can use that science-based approach that I think is the best way for us to meet this challenge.
We've exchanged business cards.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. I have a couple more questions, and if we're joined by someone else, either in person or virtually, we'll recognize them for their questions. But thank you again for joining us today and for your responses. I have a question for the entire panel, and I'm going to ask each of you to take a shot at this. But would you just share with us a list of maybe your top 2 or 3 action items in order of priority? That the federal government should take to address PFAS contamination that would be most helpful to your community, to your state, and maybe to our nation. I'll take a shot at that. And Ms. Ann, would you mind taking that one?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. My top three, very easy. Number one, set a federal drinking water standard for PFAS. Get the MCL set. Number two, please declare PFAS a hazardous substance under CERCLA. This will begin the cleanup process. And number three, set a deadline for cleanup for legacy PFAS pollution that the DoD and industry must adhere to. They're my top three.
Thank you. Mr. Manuela?
I mean, my top, I think we're going to see a lot of consistency. Our top recommendation would be an MCL, as well as a water quality standard recommendation. We're working right now with an advisory level, but advisory levels are just that. Right on the face of the advisory level, it says these are not for regulatory purposes, which creates a significant problem from the environmental protection standpoint, putting limits and permits on producers. We need a method of keeping this material out of the environment, not necessarily outlawing the material, but if industries are going to use it for the benefit of all, there needs to be a method of treatment, capture, proper disposal, so that we keep this material out of entering the environment.
Thank you. My father would, who's now deceased, would describe that as common sense. That's what I do.
Correct,
All right.
Senator.
Mr. Meehan?
Senator, and not to be facetious, but funding would be our three top. The costs here are over and above what you normally expect a ratepayer to shoulder. That is the normal replacement of pipes and distribution lines and treatment processes. This is almost an intervention from deep space that is just going to upturn all the budgets of utilities throughout the country. But taking funding is one, an MCL is necessary to bring some order and understanding of reasonable, cost-beneficial rule. And I think, again, following up on my testimony, we've got to get TSCA in the game, Toxic Substance Control Act. Thank you.
Well, as it turns out, there's a woman named Dr. Michal Friedhoff, who is an expert on TSCA and helped us write the bill.
We have been in touch with her.
With the help of Senator Capito, we're going to get her confirmed. That would be great. All right, Secretary Kenny, please.
Senator, thank you. Our top three actions in order of priority would be to list PFAS as a hazardous waste under RCRA. That would start the prevention of PFAS from continuing to move in the environment unregulated. I think second would be the setting of a national drinking water standard, which would then allow states certainty, as well as the drinking water treatment facilities, to work towards that. And third would be, again, funding. We cannot manage the workload we have right now as states. I cannot ask my legislature to keep funding work that has no regulatory background, and we yet still need to protect our citizens.
Yeah, I on the funding front, sometimes people call me recovering governor. I'm also recovering state treasurer, and this federal government clearly has significant obligations in this regard across the country, to communities, to families, and all. This is not entirely a federal burden, and their states have some responsibility and some capability to be helpful. The companies that have produced and created this problem have some responsibility. So it's a shared responsibility. Some of the greater share, I believe, falls on the federal government, but it's not solely on the federal government. I think the next question I want to ask. Let me see. I want to say if I've heard from each. Who have I not heard from in terms of the top three? Is it anybody not responded? Okay. Good. All right. Senator Capito, why don't you go ahead, and then I have a couple more.
I'm finished, yeah.
Okay. I have a question for Mr. Meehan, and this is with respect to data needed for national drinking water standards. In your testimony, Mr. Meehan, you mentioned the importance of the Safe Drinking Water Act process to carefully determine a substance potential risk to public health. The reasons for a deliberative process to establish a substance risk are obvious. Many experts, and I might add a number of members of Congress, believe that the necessary evidence exists to establish a drinking water standard for PFOA and PFAS right now. And yet, if we were to allow the Safe Drinking Water Act process to play out according to existing laws and regulations, it could take another 5 or 6 years to finalize a standard. For two chemicals as prevalent and as risky as PFOA and PFAS, do you believe that the EPA can and should establish drinking water standards much sooner than the Safe Drinking Water Act process would seem to dictate?
It's difficult, and it is a process that does take a lot of work, so. I think they're going to move, they're moving very expeditiously as to PFOA and PFAS and maybe a few additional parameters. And I think we'll see movement on that pretty fast. Whether it's going to be as fast as a lot of people like, that's a good question. But the process is in place. It's a good process. We stand by it. And I think in the long run, given the cost consequences, given the impact on ratepayers, given the other pressing priorities, not to mention lead and copper rule, we're not even talking about Legionella, where people die, or disinfection byproducts, which is coming down the road. I think it's worthwhile to get this right and regulate in a, as I say, a prudent and cost-beneficial manner, and that would be our perspective, Senator.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Closing statement, any closing thoughts, Senator Capito?
No, I just appreciate the panel. I think we've learned a lot. I think I share your frustration that I want this drinking water level, as I've tried to put in legislation, out much sooner than what we expect it to be, and I'm going to keep pushing on that because I think that's critical. We've heard it from everybody. And so, Mr. Chairman, I think we've got some good marching orders here in terms of this. The good news is this is the good news. Bad news is the bad news is this exists. The good news is it's a bipartisan effort. I think most every state has some kind of a base that's probably used some of this fire foam or firefighting foam, or at least has exposures to it. And so we're going to keep fighting with that. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This is glass half full. Obviously, a huge amount of adversity. But there's some opportunity. Again, this committee has a great tradition of bipartisan cooperation and simply identifying problems and going to work to address them, and to work with, in this case, the industry, with state and local governments, with the communities that are affected. I just want to share with you a quick two quick stories. I spent, I thought, 18 years flying as a naval flight officer out of Willow Grove Naval Air Station, Miss Stanton, as you know. And before that, I was a naval flight officer on active duty during the Vietnam War, and when we weren't overseas, we flew out of Moffett Field, California, which is right on 101, close to Mountain View exit. And the Navy shared a large base with NASA. Had big NASA planes. We had a bunch of Navy P-3s, which was a pretty big plane too. And one day when I was driving to work early in the morning and coming down 101 from where I was living in Palo Alto, I saw black plumes of smoke coming up from Moffett Field. And it turned out that the one of the flight controls early in the morning, it's about 8 o'clock, and we had like dual runways that the planes could land alongside, so you could have two planes literally landing at the same side on not adjoining runways, but parallel runways. And sadly, very sadly, tragically, air controller directed two aircraft to land, and it's not on parallel runways, but on the same runway. Large NASA plane literally crushed a Navy P-3 plane, and we lost, I think, almost all but one member of the crew. I think 12, 13 people were killed. And unfortunately, nobody on the NASA plane was killed. But by the time I got onto the base, the planes were surrounded by firefighting teams. A lot of firefighting foam had been dispensed in an effort to try to save lives, and we lost a lot of lives that day. Fast forward to 2006, I'm driving south on State Route 1 from my home up in northern Delaware, Wilmington, heading for southern Delaware, Sussex County, and I drive by the Dover Air Force Base, and large plumes of smoke coming up just to the southern end of the approach to one of our main runway, and a C-5M, C-5B, one of the largest planes in the world, had been pre-flighted, loaded, full load of gas, full load of cargo, and took off to they had, I think, for Afghanistan or someplace maybe in Europe, and they had 4 engines on the C-5, and as they took off and climbed out, they got a warning light on one of the engines that something was amiss. And the flight engineer turned off the wrong engine, and and realized his mistake, and then he turned off the right engine. The problem was, with a full load of gas and a full load of cargo, you don't climb out very well and make it to the other side of the world. And the plane realized quickly they had a problem, and they circled back and tried to land on their same runway that they had taken off from. Didn't quite make it. That's the bad news. The good news is the crews, the firefighting crews, were ready. They were alerted. They knew it was a problem. And when the plane crashed a little less than a mile south of the approach runway, they were immediately surrounded, and firefighting foam was dispensed. Everybody was saved. Everybody walked away from it. And there's a cruel irony here, Senator Capito, that the very substance, a product that saved those lives that day, puts a lot of other people's lives at risk. Cruel irony here. And we have an important job to do. We've talked about this. We've tried to do stuff. We have people on this committee, especially a ranking member, Senator Stapp, and others, who put a huge amount of time and effort and their staffs into this. I think that the road ahead is pretty clear. It's pretty clear. If it wasn't clear before, it's clear now. And we simply got to get her done. We've got to get her done. And I look forward very much working with Senator Capito on this, as we worked on our drinking water and wastewater treatment, as we work on surface transportation and other issues, to make the kind of progress that's needed. We have in place, I think, an administration that is more inclined to be forceful and results-oriented on this front. And I very much look forward to working with the folks at EPA, the new folks, and the folks that have been there for a long period of time. We owe it to all the people that we represent, and they have a right to expect us to make real significant progress. I think, let me see if I have anything else here in a closing statement. Well, some final housekeeping, if I could. I ask unanimous consent to include in the record letters and related documents from, among others, the Environmental Protection Network, the Water Environment Federation, National Groundwater Association, and the Southern Environmental Law Center. Additionally, senators will be allowed to submit questions for the record through the close of business on June 23rd. We'll compile those questions. We'll send them to our witnesses, and we ask our witnesses to reply no later than July 7th. Anything else, Senator Capito? And I want to thank our staffs for the good work that you've done in pulling us together for this hearing. I want to thank our 3 witnesses who are here in person, and I want to thank our secretary from New Mexico for joining us as well. And if you ever see Tom Udall, our former colleague from New Mexico, give him our very best. All right, and with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you so much.